Welcome to the Ancestral Cure Podcast. I'm your host, Julian, and I'm here to guide you through the fascinating realm of holistic health. Join us as we bridge ancient wisdom with modern science to help you achieve optimal health, reclaim your vitality, and unlock your body's true potential. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Ancestral Cure Podcast. Today, I've got a very special guest with me. He is a circadian biology educator. We're going to explain what that means. And I do think he is one of the most effective and prolific voices in this circadian rhythm, circadian biology community. Please welcome Zaid K. Dahhaj.
Perfect. Thank you, brother. I'm very happy to be on, and we'll get into some fun rabbit holes and details and whatnot. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of actionable stuff for people to take as well.
Yeah, as we were talking about before we started recording, I've been following you for about 9, 10 months now, um, which was when I started going down this whole circadian biology rabbit hole. And obviously, like, I knew that the sun was good for you. I knew that sunscreen was bad for you and sunglasses, but I only sort of knew this in the framework of, oh, well, the reason you get sunburn is because of seed oils, which isn't wrong, but there's a lot more about it that we'll get into. So, yeah, I'd love for you to tell our listeners about your background, your story, what sort of got you into this whole circadian biology community.
Yeah, I mean, I centralized medical degree or anything like that, and so I have relied on being an autodidact, essentially self-taught, and just learning a lot about this stuff myself, and kind of building a theory of knowledge over time through that. And so I started off as a competitive athlete, started playing soccer at the age of 4. And that was basically my first love and passion, focused on that for maybe 20, 25 years. Wanted to go pro as many young kids do. I worked towards that to a very deep degree. I went to different countries to try to achieve that professional contract. Didn't work out in the way that I wanted to because, I mean, we're talking about 1 to 2% of people making it. And so it's a very tough sport to get into professionally. And ultimately, you do have to dedicate your entire life to achieve that goal. And so I wasn't ready to make a lot of those sacrifices. And, I think that other things in my life happened. For example, my father passing of heart disease, that was instrumental into my story and getting into the circadian stuff. And yeah, from there, it's taken on a life of its own, diving into various rabbit holes and trying to understand human health from a circadian perspective. But I really do think that circadian biology is kind of this unifying factor or bridge between all areas within health. Because as we mentioned before the call, there's a lot of infighting between groups, whether it's the carnivores versus the vegans or the keto people versus the Ray Peters. I think that this is one of those areas where we can have some real foundational agreement. And in my opinion, it explains a lot um, in a very first principle foundational sense.
Yeah, when it comes to yeah, like circadian biology, I think most people sort of understand the importance of going to bed early or not being on your phone at night or being outside. But when it comes to concepts like wearing sunscreen, wearing sunglasses, I think people sort of just they lose their minds because that's obviously the opposite of the mainstream narrative, which is you have to be wearing sunscreen, sunglasses. So I think when people start to understand circadian biology, they realize that it's actually not so crazy after all.
Exactly. It's the total opposite of crazy, actually. It's arguably it's the strongest form of science out there, in my opinion. If you look at circadian biology and the literature on it, you understand the various mechanisms involved with how the human body works from a circadian perspective. You look at things like mitochondria or light sensing opsins slash proteins. You look at all the literature out there, and I think this is one of the strongest forms of science available. And to that point, I think that we need to understand that mainstream or centralized medicine does not include circadian biology as part of their epistemology. And that is a huge problem because that means they have these various gaps in their understanding of these subjects to where essentially I can point out contradictions within their theory of knowledge because of the fact that they haven't studied this. Like the dermatologists are not learning about circadian biology or principles in their medical curriculum. And you go down the list of any specialty, and it's the same So that's a big problem in my mind, and I think that's one thing that people really need to understand to grasp this stuff.
Yes, because I think a lot of these, whether it's medicine, whether it's dermatology, whether it's pharmacology, a lot of these fields, they sort of just teach isolated concepts, but they don't actually come to any conclusions which defy the mainstream narrative. For example, I had a chemistry lecture because I'm a university student, and our lecturer said that he was talking about how sunlight's actually what's required to make vitamin D because it sulfates the cholesterol. And obviously he's correct, but I think if I put my hand up and said, doesn't that mean sunscreen's bad because it blocks UV? I think he would have looked at me as if I were crazy, even though that is the logical conclusion following what he said. So I think there's a lot of examples of how they teach you things that are correct, but they're not willing to come to the conclusions that go against the mainstream view.
Exactly. That's spot on in my opinion. I think that there's this classical distinction of reductionism versus holism. And when you look at mainstream science and also the education system involved with it, as it, ties into the medical field, it is quite literally built on reductionist principles. And so by definition, there are going to be knowledge gaps that create these sort of contradictions within this space. And I think that's the real divide when we see mainstream dermatologists talking about using SPF 50 and decentralized individuals who say that sunscreen is more of an iatrogenic intervention that creates other problems considering circadian biology. So that's, I think, a fundamental distinction we have to consider for sure.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So I think it'd be really helpful if we start by going over the basics of circadian biology and circadian rhythms. Say someone's never heard of this concept before, so how do we begin to educate people and help them unlearn what they've been absorbing from years and years of just thinking that wearing sunscreen or wearing sunglasses is the best thing to do?
Mm. I think the most basic or straightforward way that I could explain this is that circadian biology is all about how your body is built to respond to the light and dark cycle. So if we look at every aspect of the human body, from organ systems to individual organs to the skin, the brain, the eyes, all of these things are fundamentally light sensing, and they're also under circadian control. Every organ is a circadian organ. Every hormone is a circadian or hormone, whether you're talking about testosterone or estradiol, progesterone. And so that is absolutely key because we fundamentally start with first principles. And we're starting at the right place as opposed to starting from a mainstream place, which doesn't include the circadian foundation. So we're talking about a circadian system that is the human body that is controlled by the movement of the sun and the moon, which means that the duality between light and dark is really key here. And I think further to that point, we have to also consider what the full solar spectrum is about. And so if I were to break it down in a simple manner, you have only 3 to 5% of the sun's light is actually UV at ground level, which is pretty interesting and shocking to some people because, I mean, you look at mainstream recommendations and fear mongering, you would think that over 90% of the solar spectrum is like UVA and UVB, but it's only 3 to 5% at ground level. If you go to the visible part of the spectrum, that makes up about 42 to 45%. What I say for everyday people is to consider the rainbow in that discussion because you have colors like red, green, blue, and I think all light wavelengths fundamentally play an important role in human health, many of which science has yet to catch up on, but there's still a lot of literature on various wavelengths. And then the last part of it is the infrared spectrum, and that makes up around 50 to 55% of the sun's light. And if you look at the literature on infrared or red, these longer wavelengths are just incredible in their ability to heal the human body and just allow for systemic function. So from my perspective, I think that the human body is meant to receive full spectrum sunlight that is raw directly onto the skin without anything like sunglasses or sunscreen or contact lenses, any of these what I consider iatrogenic interventions. And further to that point, the human body is also expecting darkness after nightfall with very minimal circadian lighting. And so that's something that I try to break down as simply as possible for people. But does that kind of make sense? Does that jive with, just general understanding?
Yeah, it does. So it essentially is the study of how our bodies were meant to absorb and harness and utilize different wavelengths of light at different times of the day, depending on what time it is, or depending on what how strong the wavelengths are. So it's like yeah, different times of the days could have like during the sunrise, there's less UV light, it's just infrared, and then during obviously the midday, or during the early mornings, it's UVA, and then during the afternoon, it's UVB. So is it sort of just this study of how as humans, we are meant to respond to the variations in wavelengths throughout the days.
Exactly. It's essentially that. And I think that if we look at modern life, it's completely inverted the light and dark cycle. As a matter of fact, I don't even think we have a light and dark cycle because most people are spending upwards of 95% of their time indoors. And so you have very low lux or light intensity. At the most, you might get 1,000 lux, but that's nothing compared to full spectrum sunlight outside, which, is in the range of 100,000 plus lux. And so you have dark days, but you also have very bright nights. And so the light and dark cycle, as human beings have evolved with, is completely inverted. And I think that's a foundational piece of why we see modern chronic disease rates skyrocketing. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion is pointed towards because people say that full spectrum sunlight or UV exposure from the sun causes skin cancer, for example, but they're not considering that isolated blue after sunset can cause various types of skin cancers, can mess with the anti-cancer defenses in the body. And there's a lot of conflating factors involved, but they all point to this chronic circadian disruption.
Yeah, so should we start to debunk the myth that the sun or UV, if you will, is inherently bad and it causes skin cancer? So where should we start? Should we start by talking about how a lot of these studies done were actually conducted with isolated UV? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty crazy, but I think the study design for almost every mainstream piece of research on quote unquote sunlight is completely flawed. I mean, we're talking about them using isolated UV, which is not the same thing as full spectrum, with UV included. They're doing this research on nocturnal animals, often albino, most susceptible to skin damage from this isolated UV. And also, we have to consider that mice do not have the same function and repair skin cycles as human beings. It's for the most part inverted. And then outside of that, I mean, you're talking about isolated blue light in laboratory environments, the non-native EMF coming from all the technology and machines in that kind of setting. And that doesn't tell us anything about full spectrum sunlight applied to a circadian diurnal creature such as human beings. And then also, furthermore, to that point, you have this research being done on skin cell cultures, so in vitro. And that I think is problematic because it's a very reductionist study design. It doesn't tell us anything about the overall organism from a holistic perspective. You look at skin cells in isolation, they're not connected to blood flow, they're not connected to hormesis, they're not connected to any of these things that we normally see in somebody's lifestyle because of the fact that lifestyle is a holistic thing, right? And yeah, that's I think the number one biggest problem is that the study design is just so flawed just straight out the gate.
Exactly. I mean, if they're taking isolated blue light in a lab, or not isolated UV, but you're in a lab with blue light and it's done on nocturnal rats, rats that shouldn't be awake during the day anyway. Obviously it's gonna look like they're suffering from it, but that does not apply to humans whatsoever in the context of full spectrum sunlight, which is yeah, 3% UV. Um, but then, yeah, the fact that it's 3% UV, that doesn't mean that UV is inherently bad. It just means in when you look at full spectrum sunlight, it's got the infrared, it's got the visible light. These they sort of balance each other out and cancel out the negative effects of each one in isolation, I guess.
Exactly. I think that people love to throw around the word damage, quote unquote damage, but that really kind of it's a very reductionist way to view it because if we look at hormesis and how the human body is designed to operate, the hormetic effect is foundational. I mean, you look at training and exercise, there's a reason why, hormesis is at play because at least acutely in a temporary time phase, like you are damaging muscles and ligaments and whatnot. But if you look at the complete picture, things like sleep, allow for that quote unquote damage to be fixed and then to allow for hormetic benefit. And so hormesis is all about the intentional application of a small stressor done over time while being paired with recovery and so that it can create adaptation. And if we're talking about species on this planet, I mean, adaptation is really the foundation of it all. And so it's kind of crazy to me when people call it damage because they're not considering the full picture. And we also have to consider that, again, we are a circadian diurnal creature. Every aspect of the human body is built around full spectrum sunlight, which means that UV cannot inherently cause any form of disease. Otherwise, we would not exist on this planet as we are today. Like it would just completely annihilate our species to begin with.
Yeah, that's what I tell people. I'm like, if the sun was so bad for us and it was killing people and causing skin cancer, shouldn't we have died out like 10 years into our existence? Do you know what I mean? Um,
So that's
yeah. And then the response is always, well, um, they'll say stuff like, well, that's because the ozone layer didn't let in, like, it lets in a lot more UV light now, which is why we need sunscreen and sunglasses, whereas our ancestors didn't. So, what's the rebuttal to that? Because it just doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, there's a lot of nuance with the ozone layer stuff. The ozone layer is healing because of, I think it's something called the 1979 Montreal Project, which basically phased out a lot of these industrial chemicals that destroyed the ozone layer. If you look at a place like Australia or New Zealand, the ozone layer primarily takes place over Antarctica, but because of the seasonal shift, it does go over those countries during certain periods of the year. But even then, I think there's a huge logical contradiction, which is that from the mainstream perspective, they're saying that UV light is inherently carcinogenic and toxic for the human body. So again, that just points to the a completely illogical conclusion, and it just shows that they're not taking into account evolutionary biology. They're not taking into account circadian biology by the mere fact that almost every species on this planet needed UV and full spectrum sunlight to survive to begin with. So again, there's like 1,000 of those kind of contradictions within the mainstream paradigm. And I think a large part of my job is to kind of point out a lot of those contradictions to show people that it is kind of ridiculous to believe in that philosophy.
Yeah, um, that's definitely true. I mean, when I talk to people about how the sun isn't actually bad for us and it doesn't actually cause skin cancer, I I use the concept of hormesis and I say, well, it's just like if I were to hit the gym and decide I'm gonna squat like 140 kilograms on my first ever squat session, like I'd obviously get injured, but that's not like it's not, it doesn't mean that weightlifting's inherently bad for you. It means you just have to build yourself up. You've got to progressively overload. It's the same with
Mhm.
exercise. It's the same with like muscle hypertrophy. It's the same with like long distance running. You have to build yourself up. You can't just start at like their highest level because people think, oh, well, why is it that if I go out in the sun in Croatia, for example, for 12 hours, I'm gonna get sunburn. Like, like if you're saying that the sun doesn't cause skin cancer or sunburn, why do I get sunburn? And it's like, because you've not actually built up your body's tolerance to it. Um, and I mean, I think the whole mainstream reductionist view is that it's impossible to build up a solar callus. It's impossible to make yourself more tolerant to UV, which is why they sell things like sunscreen and sunglasses.
Yeah, it's so crazy to me. I mean, if we extrapolate on your earlier point of progressive overload and how that relates to training along with sunlight, why is it that I don't see campaigns demonizing exercise or demonizing cold exposure or sauna use? Because all of these things are built upon that hormetic foundation. And so I think that's one of the main contradictions as well. It's like if we follow the idea that UV light is inherently carcinogenic and we just strip it of the U stress and the hormetic benefit, then you should be attacking all of these other things as well, just as equally. And then also to that point, I mean, melanin is something that is extremely misunderstood within the mainstream circles. And again, it's just it's one of those things that is kind of neglected because of that reductionist worldview.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, like you said, it's progressive overload, it's hormetics, it's like it's the same way that when you're exposed to like dirt and microbes and parasites, you're actually building up your immune system because you're helping it identify harmful and non-harmful bacteria. Um, but yeah, it's not even like just health. It's like if you're an introvert or a socially awkward person, like you're gonna have to put yourself in situations with like with lots of people, and that's how you have to experience that little stress to come out better on the other side. So it's not just health, it's just the concept of like practice makes perfect. You have to allow your body to practice being in the sun. But yeah, like if you're wearing sunglasses or sunscreen, that's not going to happen. So yeah, should we start to talk a bit about like the actual science behind why the sun doesn't actually cause skin cancer? And like you said, I like the phrase you use that all of our bodies' anti-cancer mechanisms are under circadian control. Can you let's sort of like talk about that phrase a bit?
Yeah, so I go a level further and say that not only does full spectrum sunlight inherently cause skin cancer, it is actually protective against all forms of cancer, including skin cancer. And so there's a lot of science to back that up. I mean, we have to consider that the full spectrum, more specifically UVB, provides the vitamin D3 conversion that we need. Vitamin D3 is one of the most powerful anti-cancer compounds or hormones known to man. You have near-infrared light from the sun, which creates subcellular or mitochondrial melatonin, another powerful anti-cancer hormone. You have the nighttime darkness, which creates the circulatory form of melatonin from the pineal gland. Again, one of your most powerful anti-cancer hormones. So just out the gate, you have vitamin D3 and both forms of melatonin that are designed to protect you from cancer, from this duality of light and dark. And then I think if you look into the research and you study how cells work and how mitochondria are designed to work, and you just look at the cell cycle in general and how they operate, all anti-cancer defenses, which are designed to protect you against cancer, are under circadian control, which means that full spectrum sunlight within a circadian context cannot cause any form of cancer because it's designed to optimize those processes against cancer. And so we have to consider things like autophagy, apoptosis being basically the cell suicide that your body goes through um, to basically remove degraded cells and optimize cells that are already working properly. Cell cycle checkpoints, tumor suppressor genes, DNA repair is also under circadian control. So from every angle, I mean, there's probably over 100 plus anti-cancer defenses that are under circadian control. But that is a very big contradiction that we have to consider. And that's something that I think the dermatologists and the mainstream physicians aren't talking about at all because they don't know about it by the mere fact that they're not educated on circadian stuff. So that's one of the biggest things for me. And then if you go through like red, infrared, longer wavelengths, there's a preconditioning effect on cells that allow you to take advantage of the hormetic benefit of UV. I think there was this one study in particular, 1998 study in the Journal of Dermatology, that showed that preconditioning cells to near infrared light for around like 3 to 4 sessions prior to UV exposure completely negated the cytotoxic effects of isolated UV. Cytotoxic meaning cell damaging effects. So I think that's some pretty damning evidence considering that's in mainstream dermatology literature. And then you have other things like there's an SPF factor to like red and infrared. The spectral timing is a very important thing for how circadian mechanisms are supposed to work. Timing is a big component to it, but there's a lot of research to show that, it's not really the sun. It's more so the fact that we've moved away from the sun, went indoors, are around this isolated blue and non-native EMF, which also have been shown to have some very deleterious effects with cancer and whatnot.
Yeah, that's completely true. And just to clarify, I think you accidentally said that at the start. I think you accidentally said not only does the sun cause skin cancer, but we obviously know that it doesn't. Yeah.
Does not. Yeah,
Okay.
I misspoke
Yeah.
there.
But yeah, so what you're essentially saying is that if we've optimized our circadian rhythm, then all of our body's anti-cancer defense mechanisms will be optimized to prevent the sun from giving us cancer, and instead the sun will benefit us. Is that correct?
Exactly. I mean, to simplify it, if you take a creature such as a human being who is a diurnal circadian creature, adapted for a specific environment, designed to be outside most of the day, designed for nighttime darkness, and you flip that completely on its head through the advent of technology and modern living, you create the recipe for cancer manifestation. And so it's not a surprise to me that this year in 2025, we're experiencing record rates of all forms of cancer, whether it's pancreatic, colon cancer, skin cancers. But if you look at those pre-modern rates of cancer, I mean, they're probably down to they're at their lowest levels ever because we're a creature living in accordance to our evolutionarily appropriate context and environment.
Yeah, like people just don't understand that as humans we are meant to be outside. So like you said, once you completely flip it, you're obviously gonna get adverse health effects, but it's not the sun's fault, it's our fault. Um but yeah, if we sort of take this, if we sort of start from the beginning and so let's talk about the sunrise. So when you wake up and you watch the sunrise, you're getting that infrared light, aren't you? And like you said, infrared light has it produces melatonin. It's got an SPF factor. So let's talk about infrared light in particular and in the context of watching the sunrise.
Yeah, the sunrise is incredible. I often call it the first domino that you push to create systemic circadian alignment. So that's arguably the most powerful thing that you can do within the context of your lifestyle, from many different angles. I mean, we talked about the preconditioning. So if you get outside during sunrise and you watch that, you get most of your skin exposed. Not only are you creating circadian alignment in the master circadian clock, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but you also then allow that signal to be relayed to all the peripheral clocks. And so peripheral clocks are attached to every organ, protein, arguably enzyme and whatnot in the body. So that's a very important thing. In relation to the skin, that circadian alignment will translate into the skin clocks within the skin barrier. And that's important because if we understand what these peripheral clocks are designed to do, they essentially control function and repair cycles. So for the skin and for managing various things like proper pigmentation, proper mitochondrial function, arguably the most powerful thing you can do is to watch sunrise and get your skin exposed. Um, this will also precondition you, especially if you're lighter skinned, to the upcoming UV because UVA comes out about an hour after sunrise generally. UVB comes out maybe 45 minutes to an hour after that UVA. So there's a transition phase to this, and every spectrum of light from the sun translates into different circadian results from a timing perspective. So you're going to get massive preconditioning, which means that you're able to tolerate a lot more UV exposure and gain the benefits of UVA and UVB. You're less likely to burn. You're more likely to pigment properly, so you don't have anything like melasma or hyperpigmentation or any of those type of weird manifestations. Um, and then outside of that, I mean, you're definitely increasing mitochondrial efficiency by upregulating electron transport function and creating more ATP within the system. So there's a lot to it, but I think again, it's such a powerful lever. I think it's one of the most powerful things somebody can do.
Yeah, 100%. So wake up, watch the sunrise, get that infrared light, and then like you said, an hour after that infrared light, we get the UVA. So that is what primes us for the UVB, which comes later. And correct me if I'm wrong, but UVB is like the most demonized one out. Like between UVA and UVB, it is UVB that gets blocked in a lot of sunscreens and a lot of window glass
Mm.
as well. When we, so do most sunscreens only block UVB or do they also block UVA?
It'll probably depend on the sunscreen option, but SPF is specifically designed to block UVB. And what's shocking about SPF is that even the lowest level, I think SPF 15 blocks at least 90% of UVB. That's obviously problematic considering that UVB is needed for vitamin D3 conversion in the body. And so if you're slathering on sunscreen religiously, especially SPF 50, which blocks like 99% of UVB, you're creating very minimal amounts of vitamin D3. Even if you're like skipping on getting your arms or back or something, you're just not going to make enough vitamin D3 for optimal immune function and whatnot, which I think is a big reason why we see so much vitamin D3 deficiency, at least clinically speaking. Um, I mean, outside of the people who just don't sunbathe because they're stuck in indoor lifestyle, believe in the conventional narrative. But even if you are sunbathing and slathered in this SPF, I mean, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, so what happens if you're blocking UVB but you're not blocking UVA? UVA does that affect the way that UVA's does that affect what UVA does to your body?
I think it does. You could make the argument that UVA acutely still has some beneficial effects, like stimulating nitric oxide and whatnot. But I think the problem is that because you kind of manipulate the full spectrum from the sun, you break that hormetic context that the skin and the body's designed for. And so I think the perfect example for this is to kind of explain reactive oxygen and nitrogen species from this context of sunscreen use, because there is quite a bit of literature showing that whether it's chemical or mineral-based sunscreens, you create this runaway oxidation state or runaway free radical process to where you have too much ROS and RNS for the skin barrier and the system at large. So ROS and RNS are very important. Mitochondria create them. They're hormetic signals, but because you break the hormetic context by changing the spectrum of the sun's light, you allow that runaway phenomenon to take place. And lo and behold, if you have too much ROS and RNS, that leads to oxidative damage, and that is one of the hallmarks of cancer or just chronic disease in general. So that is, I think, a clear example of why we want to avoid sunscreen use, because we can't have the hubris to believe that we can outsmart nature. And so there's a level of humility that we need in relation to these circadian principles to get the best out of the work, because ultimately the human body is a complex system. And the moment you start to throw reckless interventions into the system is the moment you start to create these backfiring mechanisms. That's like that's like step one of systems thinking, first principles thinking. So that's a very important thing for people to consider.
Yeah, the whole body works synergistically. So if you're, like you said, if you're blocking UVB, but you're letting that UVA in, um, you are going to generate more reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species, which um, I suppose then that is what causes the skin cells to get damaged and be more susceptible to, would you just say like skin cancer from UVA, or is it just cancer in general?
I don't think UVA inherently causes, I mean, I think it's difficult to translate UVA in isolation compared to the sunscreen use because we don't really have the evidence for that. I would say the evidence for sunscreen causing skin cancers is still very weak. I don't think you can make that claim, but there are various points of evidence to point in the direction of it creating other problems that can lead to creating an environment that allows cancer manifestation to thrive. I mean, you have the photocarcinogens in these chemical sunscreens that um, require the exposure of UV and high heat to then go through a state change. That in and of itself is obviously a problem. Things like oxybenzone, avobenzone, oxochlorine, and the long list after that. Um, but yeah, I do think that the truck driver case study, for example, is a great one in dermatology, where we can see the real-time effect of chronic exposure to an artificial manipulation of light. Because, that truck driver was getting full spectrum sunlight altered through low emission glass, which completely changes the light spectrum altogether. It's not full spectrum sunlight causing it, it's that artificial spectrum. And that leading to various things like accelerated photo damage and lack of collagen, elastin, and whatnot. So it's again, there's so much nuance here, but the photocarcinogens, the oxidative damage, the fact that you're blocking UVB with SPF, which creates vitamin D3, and then layer that on to the chronic circadian disruption. I think that just sets the stage for many different problems.
Yeah, it's never just one thing. It's never just sunscreen. It's like sunscreen, the lack of the mismatch in circadian disrupt like circadian rhythm. Um, but on the topic of the glass that blocks, like is it just infrared light that blocks, or is it UV as well?
From what I know, low emission glass blocks a substantial amount of the longer wavelengths, red and infrared, and then it primarily blocks UVB. This will depend on the glass and whether it's windshield or passenger side, but the passenger side completely removes UVB for the most part, and then leaves UVA untouched. And so you're basically getting a spectrum of light that's UVA, blue light in isolation, without the counterbalancing and hormetic effects of red and infrared. And that's very problematic because I think the shorter wavelengths like UVA and blue, in isolation, that can cause damage and that can create problems in and of itself.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people are using like infrared light bulbs, aren't they? And instead of these LEDs or fluorescent lights. And I think there's a narrative that incandescent bulbs, like infrared bulbs, they're wasteful or they're bad for the environment because the infrared light that is because they're producing infrared light, which the mainstream sees as well, if it's heat, then it's a waste product. So, but like you said, that infrared light, it's still going to have a benefit on us, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most important things that people can do is just add infrared or any of the longer wavelengths back into the indoor environment. Because I think that chronic disease manifestation is in large part due to this isolated blue and the altered spectrums of light. I mean, if you look at isolated blue in the literature on that, it's been proven to cause cancer in human beings through that mechanism of circadian disruption. It is a very foreign, it's a very foreign spectrum of light to the body. And so if you think about the evolutionary context, your body doesn't know what to do with isolated blue light. It's just a shorter, higher energy wavelength that creates really systemic chaos. You know, from the very smallest level of the human body, whether it's mitochondria or cell cycle checkpoints, all the way to the highest degree of whether like, you know, how organ systems work and how just the overall system operates. So I think adding infrared is a game changer, and I think we could see a dramatic reduction in acute issues and also chronic issues if we just add that infrared back into the environment, indoors at least.
100%. Yeah, so just to clarify, the isolated blue light that we get from our phones and our computers and stuff, that's that is the same wavelength as the blue light from the sky. It's the only difference is that it doesn't come with the proportion of infrared and UV. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I forgot what specific part of the blue spectrum, maybe like 450 to 480 nanometers is where you find most isolated blue sources. And that is just one part of the blue spectrum from the sun, but it is certainly the one of the highest energy wavelength ranges. And that's an important thing to consider because, you know, that type of blue light can definitely penetrate the skin, cause other problems due to that penetration without the red and infrared. It will stop, I think, mitochondrial efficiency because if you look at research on how mitochondria work, various wavelengths of light are used for the electron transport chain within a mitochondrion, and it seems like blue can definitely stop the efficiency of that electron transport chain, but red and infrared, the longer wavelengths, brings back more of that electron flow, proton flow, and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, it's just not good news. And we consider that most people are spending basically all their lives under this isolated blue. It's a huge problem, especially at night.
It's yeah, because it suppresses melatonin, and melatonin is what our bodies need to undergo autophagy and mitophagy and yeah, cellular repair so that they're able to repair themselves. Because when you've got damaged cells, that ultimately is what leads to cancer. That's what contributes to cancer. So it's like yeah, like it's not the sun. It's the fact that we've damaged our skin cells by living in a complete circadian mismatch. But then we want to blame the sun, which is just completely nonsense, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you look at other points of research. I mean, indoor workers are at a higher likely rate of developing melanoma than outdoor workers, which is very contradictory. You have the fact that basically all melanoma patients are chronically deficient in vitamin D3, which tells us that they're not sunbathing in the appropriate circadian context. All of these people are certainly experiencing chronic circadian disruption due to modern living. Um, what else? I mean, red light has been shown to stop melanoma proliferation and alter tumor environments in very advantageous ways. And so I think there's just so many contradictions in the literature that it's obvious. But again, if you don't spend time to understand the full picture and bring in all these points of evidence, then you're obviously going to believe in the mainstream narrative, which is inherently reductive.
Yeah, I think the biggest contradiction is the fact that people will think that the sun causes skin cancer, but then they'll still sunbathe with sunscreen on. And what I'll say is because like they'll say that, oh well, nobody's saying that you shouldn't sunbathe. It's just that you have to sunbathe with sunscreen. It's the sun's really dangerous, but if you wear sunscreen, it's like it's completely fine. And I think, well, like you might miss a spot. Like the skin cancer could still like the sunlight could still penetrate you and cause skin cancer. You could miss a spot. It's like if the sun really was dangerous, you would never leave the house.
Exactly. It's an inherent contradiction. And that's a very good point. I remember writing on that, I think, a few months back. And it's also like it's completely divorced from circadian mechanisms and understanding circadian biology because like the skin barrier is a circadian organ that quite literally senses and uses all wavelengths of light for systemic function. So if you look at, you start at the epidermis, you go to the dermis, all the way down to the hypodermis. All of these layers of the skin barrier contain these opsins or light sensing proteins like melanopsin, blue sensor, um, neuropsin, UVA light sensor, encephalopsin, rhodopsin, which I think is like blue green. So the human body is quite literally designed for full spectrum sunlight exposure. That's raw.
Exactly. So I think it's time for us to get a bit more scientific, if you will. So if we go back to the myth that like the sun causes skin cancer and the idea that all of our anti-cancer mechanisms are under circadian control, I always think about melanin, I think about vitamin D, I think about POMC, because that's obviously like a protein that gets cleaved into different things depending on what wavelengths of light you're getting. And I think about P53, which is the
Mm.
anti-tumor suppressing protein. So if we just talk about like all of these things, so should we start with POMC because that's sort of like the the backbone of our body's anti-cancer mechanisms.
Mm. Yeah, POMC is incredible. I mean, studying the work of because I got into this work originally from Dr. Jack Kruse through his original podcast with Andrew Huberman, Rick Rubin on the Tetragrammaton podcast, and his explanation of POMC was just incredible to me. I mean, it opened so many new doors. So, the POMC gene is a gene that basically everybody within our species has. There are some rare exceptions, people who have POMC genetic deficiency and whatnot, or just these weird genetic defects with POMC. But regardless, I mean, we have to understand that the POMC gene and the POMC system at large is under circadian control. It's tied to full spectrum sunlight, more specifically UV exposure. And so the moment you expose your skin and eyes to UV, both UVA and UVB, you get the activation of the POMC gene, which then translates into the pro-opium melanocortin protein, and then that is cleaved into various peptide hormones like beta endorphin, the melanocyte stimulating hormone. All of these peptide hormones have different roles to play in human biology. I mean, like beta endorphin being a very powerful analgesic compound, being an opioid peptide, which is great for, reduction of pain and whatnot. So we have to understand that UV light's very important for that. I think that's just inherently contradictive against the mainstream narrative as well, which states that UV is just inherently damaging. And then, yeah, you go down the list. I mean, I don't know. There's probably 14, 15 different types of peptide hormones that have different effects, but it's a pretty powerful lever that people can rely on to prevent chronic disease, but also optimize just overall health and performance. And I think if you look at pharmaceutical companies and the drugs that they make, there are specific drugs that are actually tied to POMC. So, I think that these sort of conglomerates know about the power of full spectrum sunlight as it relates to the science on this because the science is readily available on PubMed, NCBI, all that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, the more sun you can get just raw into the eyes peripherally, onto the skin through sunbathing when UVA and UVB are out, the more you'll activate POMC, which then has just profound systemic effects.
Yeah, and so it's alpha MSH, which is the primary or it's the most significant one. That's alpha MSH is what makes melanocytes to make melanin. And I like me myself, I've sort of changed my wording because I used to say that well, melanin is what protects us from the UV damage from the sun. And I mean that's not wrong, and it might sound like I'm being a bit pedantic or it's just like semantics, but I think it's better to say that melanin um it allows you to harness the UV light and the sunlight for good because someone might
Mm.
think, oh well, why do I need melanin if I'm not getting UV light? Like, well, there's actually a lot of other benefits. It's not just that it's protecting you from damage caused by UV light. Like, it's doing a lot of these other things too. But
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful that we don't frame it as like the only reason you need melanin is because you're out in the sun. Like, it's not just a response. It actually does a lot of necessary things as well.
Exactly. Like again, I think that's another reductive mistake that people can make very easily because they're not hip to a lot of the research on melanin and its function. So obviously photoprotection is a very important part of melanin production and the reason why it exists in different species. But again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Eumelanin responsible for the blacks and browns in nature, darker skinned people. I mean that type of photoprotection is off the chart. It's like 99.9% of UV is blocked and dissipated into heat, while the rest is used for systemic purposes. Pheomelanin in lighter skinned people is about 20 to 40% blockage, so to speak. And but we need to understand that the literature shows all of this very clearly in that it's antiviral, it's anti-tumor, it's anti-cancer. Melanin is radioprotective, as we mentioned. It actually acts as a heavy metal detoxifier within the system at large, so it can adsorb heavy metals from the skin barrier and basically detoxify them at a slower pace to not damage the body. It's incredible what melanin is responsible for, and we have to understand from an evolutionary perspective, this thing's been around since the beginning of time and the beginning of life on this planet. So it's pretty crazy that they call it just a sign of skin or DNA damage.
Yeah, because I think if melanin were just, I think if the only thing it did were protect us against UV damage, then you could argue that it's not a benefit, it's just like a net neutral. But the fact that it's doing all these other things, like you said, it's detoxifying heavy metals, it's um like it splits the water molecule so that the electrons enter the mitochondria. Like it's doing all of these, it's doing all of these great things. And like you said, we've got different types, right? You've got pheomelanin and eumelanin, um, and that relates to like how dark you are, like your skin pigment. So would you say that there's variations in how, let's say, like lighter skinned people versus darker skinned people harness and utilize melanin, like or sunlight exposure in general? Like, is it that like darker skinned people need more sunlight, which is why they're able to spend more time without burning, and lighter skinned people need less? Like, what's the nuance there?
Generally, I would say that's true. It is a very interesting thing because as it relates to human biology, there are three different types. I mean, the eumelanin, pheomelanin, you also have neuromelanin in the brain. And so with darker skinned people, they certainly need a lot more UV because of the fact that eumelanin is an incredible photoprotective compound. Again, 99.9% of UV is blocked by type. With pheomelanin, with lighter skinned people, they just need to spend a lot less time in that UV context to get the benefit that a darker skinned person would. So, if a lighter skinned person or a darker skinned person needs to spend an hour in peak UVA, UVB, lighter skinned person could probably spend like 20, 30, 40 minutes and get the same benefit, if not even more. So they're just more efficient at absorbing vitamin D3. If you think about the migration patterns of human beings, we started in specific areas within Africa, and then a certain section of people went up to higher latitude countries. That type of lighter skin was evolved as a means to compensate for lower UV and higher latitude conditions. So it makes sense. You're just more efficient at absorbing UV. But I think that one really cool fact as well, before I even mention that, I mean, lighter skinned people are at a higher risk of burning because of that melanin that they have. And so they have to be a lot more intentional about the circadian work, which makes circadian alignment even more important for them, especially in the modern day environment. But even, outside of that, I mean, you can't have senses without melanin. I think that's one of the more incredible things. Like if you look at eyes, melanin content within the eyes, the brain, touch, hearing, the inner cochlea within the ears. I mean, that contains melanin as well. It quite literally acts as like this middleman between the environment and your ability to sense things in the environment. So I think that's also where you can see melanin destruction from modern life translating into various things like tinnitus or eyesight degradation, things of that nature, which is just pretty cool to understand.
That's interesting. Could that be the reason that if, say, a black person, like a dark-skinned person, moved to, say, a northern latitude like Scandinavia, and they're not getting that sunlight, they're not like even if they were completely like circadian trained, like they still probably wouldn't be able to get the amount of UV that would benefit them, or is it not that big of a deal? Like, is the difference like negligible?
I think it's inevitable to a certain degree. It's a very tough question because you can make the argument that if a darker skinned person was to be like super cold adapted, cold is very important in this discussion. Maybe they would produce enough biophotons within the UVB range to maintain a certain level of melanin. But at the end of the day, if you are a darker skinned person and you live in Seattle, I think that's problematic. You should try to prepare yourself to, move to a more equatorial environment so that you can thrive. Whereas a lighter skinned person, I think, has a lot more leverage to be able to go high latitude, assuming they're also in circadian alignment, getting cold, darkness at night, all that, but they can actually move to the equator if they're very strict and intentional about the circadian stuff. So, morning or priming in the morning, intentional sunbathing during midday, and then the darkness at night. I've seen a lot of people, including heads, avoid burns, improve pigmentation, build that solar callus, so to speak, so that they can thrive.
Yeah. And when we talk about solar callus, like we've talked about POMC, we've talked about melanin. Let's talk a bit about vitamin D, like vitamin D3. And so it's UVB light that actually makes vitamin D3. And would you say that vitamin D deficiency is the biggest or is one of the biggest drivers of skin cancer from like a mechanistic or mitochondrial level?
I mean, I would say it has to be that, along with I think the deficiency in both forms of melatonin. I would actually put both forms of melatonin deficiency at a higher level than D3 deficiency, because of melatonin's impact. It's just profound on the system at large. But yeah, I mean, you look at both of those things as like vitamin D3 more specifically as an anti-cancer hormone, activation of P53 and all these other anti-cancer defenses, especially autophagy and apoptosis. You can make the argument that it's definitely causal in any form of cancer manifestation.
Yeah, and with vitamin D as well, it's like people think that if you just take a supplement, it's gonna have the exact same effects. But even if it is vitamin D3 in particular, you're not gonna be sulfating the cholesterol that because that's what the UVB does, isn't it? It like sulfates cholesterol. You make vitamin D3 out of it, and then but if you're bypassing that step, like what are the risks with supplementing vitamin D?
I think there's a number of them. I mean, because you're taking a completely foreign input and you're throwing in a complex system, like other side effects occur. I mean, so you can have the discussion of overdosing on vitamin D3 from a supplement is a very real thing. You can't overdose from vitamin D3 from sunbathing, in my opinion. I mean, obviously, if you get a burn or you get a very severe burn, that's a sort of an overdose of full spectrum exposure, but that doesn't apply to vitamin D3 synthesis. There's obviously a stopgap or just an intentional process that's very complex behind that to where you don't get any over symptoms. Outside of that, I think that this is something that's very profound to me, like vitamin D3 as it relates to wintertime as well. We have to consider that there are many different forms of vitamin D. There are many different metabolites. And so I think the last I checked, there's over 20 plus metabolites of vitamin D that go through various storage processes. There are different soluble forms. So there's fat soluble, there's water soluble, and I think that ties into the seasonal perspective on this. But yeah, vitamin D from a pill is nowhere near UVB synthesis at all.
Yeah, 100%. And I've heard that maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong or add some nuance to this, but I've heard that if you're taking a vitamin D supplement, especially during winter, you're gonna because vitamin D and melatonin bind to the same receptor. When you take a vitamin D supplement, your body thinks that like it thinks it's the summertime or it thinks it's daytime, therefore it's not gonna release melatonin. Is that correct?
It's a very difficult question. I don't think I have a clear answer for you, but I do think that the body is kind of tricked in the same way that isolated blue light at night tricks the body into thinking it's daytime. So I think the high level answer is yes, but I couldn't really explain the specific mechanisms at the moment, especially due to the science on that.
Yeah, that's fair. But yeah, when it comes to vitamin D as well, it's like we can actually make vitamin D through cold exposure, isn't that correct? Like it has to do with like UV biophotons, it has to do with like when you're cold, the biophotons that you're making are actually able to sulfate cholesterol. So when it's wintertime, is the best strategy just like embrace the cold exposure, instead of taking the vitamin D supplement.
Absolutely. I think that So let's start from first principles. I mean, number one, you have biophotons, which are is basically the light that's produced from within as a result of various processes. But these biophotons fall into different nanometer or light wavelength ranges. You do produce biophotons in the UVB range, which is the specific type of light wavelength range that's needed to create this vitamin D3 conversion. So I think the most important thing, and this is I recently wrote an article on this interplay between vitamin D3, wintertime, and all that stuff. But if you load up on the sunny months, build as much of a vitamin D3 reserve that's stored in the body fat during the sunnier months, then that will allow you to not only withstand but thrive during the winter time. Because as soon as we head into winter and you start to take advantage of cold and more darkness at night, more melatonin at night, then you start to actually upregulate other storage forms or other metabolites of vitamin D that have various life cycles and that then I think kind of interplay with vitamin D3 that's fat soluble in the body fat. And so when you get cold, you also lose body fat if you do everything else appropriately, which means that you're dumping more D3 into the system. I've even had people who have told me that they've quite literally DM'd me saying that their vitamin D3 is higher during the winter months. They're also in circadian alignment. That's a big factor than than it is summer months, which is a very interesting thing to me. But either way, we need to understand that these 20 plus vitamin D metabolites work synergistically, they work seasonally. And if you do the right things, you will be well prepared to not only withstand the winter, but also thrive during the winter time, which I think is very counterintuitive to people because they just automatically assume D3 deficiency is a given, which it's not. So I think that's very important from a circadian perspective.
Yeah, I think the whole cold exposure vitamin D thing's really I think that more people definitely have to learn about it. And I saw you posted something where you said that maybe our vitamin D levels aren't supposed to be the same throughout the whole year, whether it's summer or winter. And I mean, like you're not saying that it's bad to have lots of vitamin D during winter if it's like natural and through cold exposure. You're just saying that there's a seasonal aspect to it. Like you're not like even if the vitamin D that you make from cold exposure isn't as strong as during summer, it's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
No, not at all. I think that if you look at life, if you look at how the human body works, I mean, we're obviously seasonal creatures. You can make an exceptional argument for people who are like right at the equator, but even people at the equator go through seasonal changes. I mean, there's temperature variations, there's different seasons, although not as extreme as higher latitude countries. But either way, I mean, we are a seasonal creature that's meant to adapt through the seasons. And so um, vitamin D3 in my mind is more of a cyclical phenomenon where, it's obviously going to be very high during the summer if you do things right. And then you have a reserve that is also tied to these various metabolites that are water soluble and whatnot that allow you to gain different sort of benefits according to what time of year it is. And so I think this is the kind of problem that this supplementation narrative creates is that you don't consider the nuance in the context and you completely divorce yourself from the seasonal nature of life itself. It's very problematic for me because obviously like you can see this play out in different areas. Like during the summer, there's more carbohydrate availability for you to take advantage of. During the winter time, you're at a specific latitude, you're not making any carbohydrates through photosynthetic reaction. So obviously, like this just takes place in all areas of life.
Yeah, and I spoke to Kira on my first episode actually, and I said when it comes to vitamin D supplementation, especially during winter, like is it like useless? Is it like is it useless? Is it a net neutral, or is it actually like bad for you? And I think she was like, yeah, there's lots of problems with supplementing vitamin D during winter. So it's really interesting that we've got this alternative method through cold exposure.
Yeah. I mean, maybe you could make the case that for very extreme and nuanced circumstances, like if someone's super deficient, you can start them off on on a few IUs or a few thousand IUs to begin with, maybe for like a week or two. But then ultimately you want to transition them out and get them into the sun because you're just going to create different metabolites of vitamin D. You're going to get many other benefits along with full spectrum sunlight, like nitric oxide from UVA, the longer wavelengths like red and infrared. It's just a no-brainer for me to somebody who's very deficient out into the sun as opposed to putting them on a pill.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people think that sunbeds or tanning beds are a good idea during winter. And I sort of fell into this trap as well back when I was in like the Ray Peats community. And it was like very dogmatic. And they were saying like they almost treat winter as if it's like a mistake that yeah, like winter just wasn't meant to happen. Just wait until summer. Until then, just pretend it's summer. Like trick your body into thinking it's summer. Whether it's like yeah, like a sunbed, for example. I think it was do you know who Veronica is? Veronica on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, so she tweeted something about sunbeds during winter. And to be fair, she did say that like if you're going to use a sunbed, you should use red light therapy, you should use vitamin E, you should have all like coconut oil and I just thought like sure, but like if you've got to do all of that just to use a sunbed, you might as well just embrace the cold. But I just don't think I was aware of that when I was in the Ray Peat community.
Yeah, I think there's again, it's just more of like that reductionist kind of mentality that leads us to various problems. The tanning beds are very interesting, are using isolated UV, mostly isolated UVA from what I've seen, maybe 95% UVA with 5% UVB. But I think the important thing to understand is that we are very naive to believe that the benefits you get from full spectrum sunlight as it relates to UV are the benefits you get from UV in isolation with a tanning bed. Two completely different contexts for the body. We need to understand that various things like immune system are tuned to full spectrum with UV included. Whereas if you're getting a tanning bed, for example, you don't get the priming of immune cells, you don't get the right immune activation and whatnot. You don't get the preconditioning, even if you use red and infrared. I think so complex that it's kind of naive for us to think that we can replace that with a tanning bed, even if that tanning bed includes red, longer wavelength red light. Because obviously they can include infrared because there's a lot of heat to that. But yeah, it's crazy to me, and I think that there are a lot of examples systemically of how tanning beds do not come even close to full spectrum sunlight with.
Yeah. I used to defend sunbeds actually because and I defend it the same way that I defended the sun. I was like, the sun's not bad for you, like UV's not actually bad for you, but I didn't understand the nuance between the fact that like yeah, the sun's 3% UV, whereas sunbeds are 100%, usually 100% UV. And it's funny because the people I was debating with, I mean, they were right, but they were still like they were right for the wrong reasons. Like they thought sunbeds were bad because they thought like UV is inherently bad, when in reality it's the proportion you're getting. Like UV from the sun, because it's 3% and it's balanced, it's not bad. Like a sun, like yeah, like the sun and a sunbed aren't the same thing. Um,
Oh,
so
I
I
mean,
think
look, at the end of the day, sorry to interrupt, but like if you're talking about 3 to 5% UV from the sun that's balanced by red and infrared, and in a bed, you're talking 95% UVA with 5% UVB with no red and infrared. That is a big problem, and I think the time agree with the World Health Organization in its assessment that tanning beds are a what is it, type 1, type 2 classified. That's where I do agree because you're completely removing the context. And even from a very high level perspective, all of those anti-cancer defense systems in your body, they rely on circadian timing. UV in isolation disrupts the circadian timing of the system. They rely on full spectrum sunlight too. And so, if you start to implement tanning beds at night, you start to do all this nonsense. I think it's a recipe for disaster over time if you do it chronically.
yeah. Do you feel the same way about red light therapy and red light panels? Because I mean that is isolated infrared light, or do you just see it as like we like are everyone's so deficient in infrared light that for it to be a concern, like it's not a concern yet. Like maybe it's a concern if everyone becomes like circadian entrained, but at the moment when everyone's deficient in infrared light, like is it just not a concern to be using isolated infrared light when it comes to red light panels?
I wouldn't say it's not a concern because there are things you have to take into account, like, are you using it at night? The panels are pretty high lux, and in my opinion, that can disrupt pineal melatonin, which needs darkness. The non-native EMF from these panels should be considered. I mean, I've tested a few of these panels in relation to like RF radio frequencies and magnetic or forgot the other metric, but they do score pretty high the closer you get to, which is concerning in my mind. But I think the important thing about red and infrared and these longer wavelengths in general is that the safety profile is pretty much off the charts. And you can't say the same thing about isolated UV or blue being shorter high energy wavelengths because the research just doesn't back that up. I think that photobiomodulation using isolated red and infrared shows an incredible capacity to heal, to improve organ function. There's many use cases for it. But with isolated UV and blue, I don't think the same can be said. So you have a lot more leverage to be able to use these wavelengths in isolation, as opposed to the shorter wavelengths.
Yeah, and I wonder if, like, ancestrally speaking, um, the benefit we'd get from using isolated red light therapy is basically just what our ancestors had, like having all of these different wavelengths in proportion. You could argue that maybe it's not the fact that it's isolated, it's the fact that it's restoring us back to balance.
Yeah, I think to your point, that accounts for most of the benefit. It's just the fact that us as a circadian species, for the most part, we're infrared and red deficient. And so when you throw those back in, the body, especially the mitochondria, respond very favorably to that, especially with energy production.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, I do want to touch on sunglasses. But before that, I do want to say that, like, I hope this is obvious enough, but like we're not saying like stop wearing sunglasses, stop wearing sunscreen, but do everything else the same. Like we're not saying that you should like continue to like the only thing that you should change is not wearing sunglasses and sunscreen. Like it's all of these factors. It's like it's optimize your circadian rhythm. It's expose yourself to sunlight intermittently. It's yeah, avoid blue light at night. So I think people might hear it us. I hope not, but because I've had people tell me that like you can't just tell people to stop wearing sunscreen and sunglasses if you're not going to talk about all these other things, which like I am talking about it. It's really important.
Yeah, there's especially for like the way I approach it, I will point out the problem, but I will also give people very actionable solutions. So, in the case of sunglasses, let's say you deal with light sensitivity. I think that sunglasses, for the most part, chronic use does actually cause that light sensitivity. So when you remove them, you need to get adjusted. And I think the most important thing you can do for that is to watch the sunrise, to be outside more often, even if it's under shade. Get your eyes adapted over time. Again, progressive overload applied to the ocular system eventually removes the light sensitivity, which then opens up an entirely new world for you. Because if you were somebody who used sunglasses chronically and you were light sensitive, what kind of mental shift is that going to create when you finally experience what it's like to not have light sensitivity and to basically understand that sunglasses are bullshit in most scenarios?
Yeah, it's like it's a withdrawal symptom. It's like when you get off cigarettes or alcohol or drugs, it's like you're gonna have these nasty symptoms, but that's because you've been so reliant on them. But yeah, so with sunglasses, what I've heard is that our eyes have like aromatic amino acids, and because I'm a chemistry student, so like I know what that means. It's like the benzene rings, and like
Mhm.
tyrosine, tryptophan, histidine, and phenylalanine. And when they absorb UV light from the sun, it gets converted into other metabolites. So I know tyrosine turns into dopamine, into melanin, and tryptophan into serotonin, into melatonin. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's one thing that I try to educate people on as much as I can, especially everyday layman people, because they just don't understand that full spectrum sunlight, more specifically UV, peripherally goes through the eyes, hits these aromatic amino acids that are structurally made of benzene rings, which absorb UV and then go through a transformation state or transformation change. And so that eventually leads to some of your most powerful hormones and neurotransmitters, which I mean, that's one thing, that's a big reason why I recommend that UVA rise in particular in the morning, because you're getting such a powerful dose of hormonal and neurotransmitter optimization that people are just not considering. They just don't think about the first principles behind this.
Yeah. So it's like we said, it's the aromatic amino acids. It's also the like the opsins, like the rods and the cones, isn't it? Like the encephalopsin, neuropsin, melanopsin. Are these like found in the eyes as well?
Yeah, they're for the most part, I think most of them are found in the eye. I think the most notable one is melanopsin, the blue light sensor. We have to consider that the melanopsin in particular, within these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells in the eye, is at the heart really of photoadaptation or allowing your eyes to adapt to various light levels in the environment directly into the dopamine that's produced from the response to high lux light outside. And so you have this melanopsin activation, you have the retinal dopamine being created in the retina, and those two things are very powerful levers to create photoadaptation, which removes the light sensitivity. So even from a first principles biophysical perspective, it makes complete sense, and I think it's well founded in the literature that you can remove sensitivity, although they don't talk about that directly.
Hmm, that's really interesting. Um, but yeah, when it comes to sunglasses and sunscreen, people just don't understand that these are like crutches. They're not actually helping you in the long term. It's just a crutch for you to feel safe in the short term, but you're missing out from all of these benefits of the sun, like we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, let's be real. It's a marketing money grab. That's what it is. If you look at how many people are wearing sunglasses or who buy sunscreen, like none of these people are really interested at the surface level in understanding why they want to get these things. They just believe in the mainstream narrative that they're told to fear the sun because it'll damage you and whatnot. But ultimately, I think marketing and marketing campaigns have gone a very long way to creating this kind of society that appreciates sunglasses and sunscreen. I think the first sunscreen was created by Coco Chanel in like the early 1900s too. So there's a lot of history behind this stuff.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on like mineral-based sunscreens, like holistic sunscreens, the ones that use zinc oxide, I think, and titanium dioxide?
For the most part, I think they're still problematic because they share a lot of similarity to the chemical-based ones. Number one, you can I mean number one the mineral based sunscreens have been found to actually leach a few of those compounds into the skin barrier, which then creates that ROS and RNS runaway phenomenon, and there's research to show that. So that's one concern. But then also I think that the most obvious one is just the fact that you're blocking UVA and UVB, or just UVB, or whatever combination of the two, and that I think points to a lack of education in circadian biology because you're relying on a crutch instead of doing what makes sense from a circadian perspective. And yeah, I think it just points to largely ignorance. Like you can make the argument that every once in a while you're in an environment that you can't control, and so you have to use a mineral-based sunscreen to avoid a burn. But I think the literature on burns is kind of all over the place. Some very contradictory things in there. And then again, you can rely on physical sunscreens like clothing and shade as the most important way to avoid a burn.
Yeah, and I mean, I've always thought that like the only difference between mineral-based sunscreens and chemical-based sunscreens are that the chemicals in mineral-based sunscreens aren't as bad. Like they're not as bad as octinoxate, avobenzone, homosalate, but they're still not allowing you to actually um like entrain yourself to the sun and increase your tolerance to that UV light.
Yeah, I think from a toxicity perspective, you can make the argument that mineral-based sunscreens are a better version. But from the circadian perspective, both are inputs that create second and third order consequences because of the fact that, there's that ignorance around the education. And so I would rather have somebody, let's say, prime their skin with adequate amount of morning sunbathing on most of the skin, microdose midday UV, progressively build up, recovery with great sleep, with darkness at night. And then over time, you can build more melanin, which then gives you more photoprotection, which then becomes a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle. And so that's the most important thing that I try to get people to do for sure.
Mm. Um, yeah, because I think, tell me if you agree, but I think all of the carcinogenic compounds in chemical sunscreens like octinoxate, homosalate, avobenzone, I think they're all really bad. But I think that negative effects of them come second to the fact that you're blocking the UV light and you're not letting your body actually harness it for your advantage.
100%. There's always going to be a hierarchy here, and so for me, I think that certainly trumps anything regarding like photocarcinogens or anything like that.
Mm. Yeah, and what are your thoughts on like, I know this isn't really a mineral-based sunscreen, but like people who rub coconut oil or beef tallow or I think olive oil as well, like on their skin. Do you see that as problematic? Because I know like if it's a saturated fat, and this gets into a whole other conversation, but like you're strengthening the integrity of the skin cells. Like, do you see that as a good thing? Like, what if it's like imported coconut oil? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
For the most part, I do think that's good. I think that if we're talking about single ingredient compounds that are made from nature, you're not going to find that artificial manipulation of the full spectrum. But the moment you jump from single ingredient natural compound to, a lot of these facial moisturizers or skin products that contain various chemical man-made process or ingredients, that's the moment where you start to introduce problems. And so always stick to single ingredient sources. If you can get astaxanthin from, wild caught seafood or salmon, that's great. But if you want to do coconut oil or olive oil, I don't think that's a problem at all. I haven't
Mm.
seen any negative outcomes from that.
Yeah, because it's not like they're not actually blocking the UV light from hitting the skin. What they're doing is they're strengthening, because it's a saturated fat, they're strengthening the fat, like the fat molecules that make up our skin cells. Because we can talk about this as well, but everyone talks about how like seed oils can contribute to skin cancer, and because obviously the double bonds in these polyunsaturated fats are more susceptible to oxidation from UV. So if you're wearing like if you're rubbing coconut oil or beef tallow, like that could be protective because the saturated fat doesn't have the double bonds that make it susceptible to oxidation.
Sure, I think that a lot of that makes sense. I mean, higher oxidation, higher chronic inflammation, higher glycation. I think all of that leads to an increased susceptibility of burns. But the moment you start to introduce more stable forms of fats, whether it's monounsaturated or saturated fats, I think you just have better outcomes. Because ultimately, even from an evolutionary perspective, like when have you ever gotten corn oil or canola oil? Like obviously these things were never in the environment, but saturated fats, I think you can make the argument that you had more of those available.
Yeah, because there are a lot of like influencers who talk about how yeah, like it's seed oils that make you burn, and they're not wrong. Like that does play a factor. And I don't think they would disagree with us when we say that like it's also your lifestyle, but I just don't think they're aware that like circadian biology also plays if like just as much, if not, I think a much bigger role than seed oils.
Yeah. And I will tell you, I've had a lot of people, like a decent number of people who still consume seed oils, not to the degree that the average American does, but they're not a strict Nazi about it and they don't end up burning. They still get great outcomes with pigmentation and melanin development. So there's a lot more nuance than just like avoid seed oils completely or you'll die.
Yeah, I definitely fell into this trap where I was telling my friends and whatnot that like the reason you get sunburnt is because of seed oils, but I didn't mention anything to do with like circadian rhythms, and even though that plays a much bigger factor. Um, do you think I know this is a bit of like a niche question, but like, do you think it matters if like the coconut oil is like imported, for example?
That is a good question. I think it could. You start to get into some interesting territory with like deuterium content and seasonal nutritional perspectives. It's hard to say how much of a degree it will play because people like Dr. Jack Cruz, I mean, they take it to be the end all be all along with other parts of this work. But I'm more laissez-faire and relaxed about that. I try to eat as much seasonally and more latitude appropriate as much as I can, but sometimes I just don't do that. So think that there are other levers like morning sunrise, nighttime darkness that play a big balance within the system.
Yeah, 100%. Um, so I think when it comes to this topic, I'll get a lot of people telling me that like they don't know the science, obviously, which is fine, but they trust the dermatologist and they trust that the people smarter than them have a rebuttal to what we're saying. So I'd like to sort of like let's try to like steelman the dermatologist arguments and Like, let's talk about like what would they say in response to everything we've spoke about when it comes to like POMC, circadian entrainment, like melanin, vitamin D, P53. What would their like response be, and like what does this tell us about the way that they've been taught?
Well, I don't think they would know anything about the circadian mechanisms involved. So you'd get a lot of blank expressions. I think most of them, if not all of them, would rely on the quote unquote science that tells us that UV is inherently carcinogenic, causes thymine dimers in the case of UVB, which are DNA mutations. But again, they only look at the very reductive notion and the notion that they've been taught around that. And lo and behold, if we go into the actual science involved, they will inevitably point to in vitro models. They'll point to, those isolated UV on nocturnal animal models, and they'll point to epidemiology, which includes associational findings, observational research, all very poor pieces of evidence, which don't tell us much, if anything. And so that's, I think, the first. I think they would definitely rely on that for the most part.
Yeah, because the UV the studies on UV, like it's so easily debunkable that like part of me wants to give them a bit more credit and say, well, like they might have a different response. They might talk about how melanin, like it might protect you from the UV, but like if there's no UV, then you don't need melanin in the first place. Like they might say something to the effect of, yeah, like you don't actually need these protective mechanisms if you're not exposing yourself to the UV in the first place.
Yeah, and I would make a very simple change. I mean, it's not like you can't say I would take their statement of UV is inherently carcinogenic to UV in isolation in the context of chronic circadian disruption is carcinogenic. But again, there's an entirely new world that they just have not been taught, which is why I have such a problem with dermatologists because they're basically dishing out iatrogenic recommendations to the public. You're telling people to wear sunscreen even though we have a vitamin D3 deficiency at a population level. You're telling them to avoid the sun, which increases the risk of all chronic disease. There's science to show that as well. You're telling them to rely on what SPF and chemical moisturizers and whatnot that create second and third order consequences for the skin barrier. Again, like these are people who just they literally do not understand that the skin is a circadian organ that senses and uses light at the most fundamental level. So I would love to have more conversations with them, but they usually just call you a pseudoscientific quack and, paint you in a very specific light.
Yeah, it's just really like, do you honestly think that like a lot of these dermatologists like they don't know what POMC is, they don't know what like P53 is, or like alpha MSH, for example?
They have no clue. I think for the most part, they have no clue because I think it's ridiculous to really understand that these are people who are supposed to be experts in skin, but they don't talk about the circadian foundational mechanisms involved with the skin barrier. That in and of itself for me is just asinine. It's absolutely crazy. And so I think that it's more so ignorance as opposed to malice, for sure.
Mm, yeah, it's just frustrating because it does make sense because if you've spent like years upon years in dermatology school, like learning a curriculum, the last thing you're going to do in your free time is like research it yourself, especially if it goes against everything you've been taught.
Yeah, the last thing you're going to do is, question the education system that you've dedicated basically half of your life to, and however much, like three, $400,000 to. Like that to me is a very big ego hit, and it would make them essentially question their entire identity. So it's not, it's very understandable why they wouldn't question it.
Yeah. And they say stuff like a tan's a sign of DNA damage, because it triggers the response of like melanin and P53.
Yeah, but they don't talk about how these thymine dimers created by UVB are fixed by things like nucleotide excision repair or vitamin D3 and its secondary and third order beneficial effects. They don't talk about how circadian alignment controls DNA repair cycles and all this stuff. It's just, again, very reductive, very one-dimensional kind of thinking.
Yeah. Well, the reason I brought up the dermatologist topic is because prior to this call, I actually went on ChatGPT and I said, like, I want you to give me the strongest rebuttal, like steel man, like tell me what the smartest, most advanced dermatologist would say, because I think it's really important that we're equipped to like understand what they're saying. So I've got it up here. It says ChatGPT says that most dermatologists are trained in a photo damage model of UV exposure, not a bioenergetic or redox centered model of sunlight biology. Does that sound accurate to you?
100%. Absolutely.
And it says that. So I'm reading like a lot of. I'm reading what ChatGPT says. Are some rebuttals that they might come up with, and what they've said
Mhm.
was. So the first point is that mitochondrial or antioxidant optimization, it might reduce oxidative stress, but it can't prevent direct photochemical DNA damage from UVB photons forming cyclobutane pyrimidine dimers. Um, and it says that, yeah, like they're partially correct, but they're not talking about like the body's repair systems that are under circadian control.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you can say they're partially correct because they have a very myopic focus on one part of the equation in the same way that you're partially correct if you say that muscles are damaged acutely right after you go through strength training. Like if I give you a blood test right after you've trained legs, the hardest you have in 6 months, like you're going to have chronic inflammation, you're going to have off the charts numbers that indicate that you probably have a chronic disease state or something like that. But again, they're not considering the entire picture. They're not thinking from a holism perspective, which obviously takes hormesis into account, which changes the dynamic entirely.
Yeah, because I mean, like we said, hormesis is like the missing part of this puzzle. It's like the concept of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, you
Um,
literally can't have life without hormetic or hormesis at work. So it's like, it's at the end of the day, we have to understand that all species have adapted to the environment. And in order to adapt, you have to have hormetic stressors.
yeah,
And UV, in my opinion, is a U stressor that needs to be applied and has always been received in circadian alignment.
yeah. I like the phrase "live hormetically." It rolls off
Mm.
the tongue. It makes complete sense. Um, and then another response that ChatGPT generated was like that dermatologists might say in response is, yes, UV activates P53, but only as a stress response, not a health benefit. Um, But yeah, so what they're saying is that it might protect you from the dirt, it might protect you from damaged cells turning into cancer, but it doesn't actually mean that UV is good for you.
Then what's the point of P53 as an anti-suppressor or anti-tumor suppressor? It just doesn't make sense. Like the P53 is one of your most powerful tumor suppressing genes in existence. So like, what's the point of it altogether? It's
Right,
obviously an
yeah.
adaptation that the human body developed.
Yeah, exactly. I think um it just makes sense to me that if you've got something that is like anti-cancer, it's obviously got other roles beyond like that one particular thing that it's protecting you from.
Oh yeah. And it's not like we're talking about the effects of some isolated antioxidant that shows maybe some association. Like P53 and tumor suppressor genes and all these anti-cancer defenses lie at the very heart of how the human body works. That's how you avoid cancer. And there's a very real reason why they exist because they have served as adaptation mechanisms through many different species, going into the human species over time through hundreds of millions of years, which is why I think we find all of these things, kind of as commonalities between different ancestors and whatnot. The POMC gene and I think the opsins are a great example of this because you find opsins in like reptiles and octopus and fish. And it's just, there's obviously some evolutionary adaptation at play here.
Mm, that makes so much sense. I mean, when it comes to hormesis, I've actually got this book from um Paul Saladino, The Carnivore Code. So this was what got me into the whole like decent. I bought this book like 2.5 years ago, and he talks about the concept of hormesis in the context of like plant defense chemicals and vegetables. And what he said was and because this was my first time reading about hormesis, and he said that like the compounds in say broccoli like sulforaphane, he says that the rebuttal is that well they're acting as a hormetic pathway, like NF2, I think. NF2 is a protective pathway, but Paul said that it's only protecting you from the damage caused by like the vegetables in the first place. Um, so the reason I brought that up is because, like, would you say it's wrong? Like, if something's being like released as a hormetic response, it's obviously got like other benefits beyond protecting you from that trigger.
Oh, for sure. I think that yeah, I think UV like UVA or UVB is a good example because not only do you have benefits of like UVB creating this D3 conversion, but UVB is also responsible for some things. UVA not only does it create nitric oxide, but if you look at the literature on, destroying acne that or destroying bacteria that's responsible for creating acne, obviously UVA, neuropsin as a UVA light sensor is an adaptation because UVA provides so many other benefits. So again, like we need to transition from this reductive view to more of a holistic view, and we need to understand that the complexity in the human body is so unfathomable that science will never be able to explain it comprehensively, and that we need to have the humility to understand that there's so much more at play that we've not discovered.
Yeah, so it's like you're never going to have a molecule or a pathway in the body that only protects you from what triggers it. Like it's obviously going to, because if that were the case, it would be like a net neutral at best. But it's obviously going to have like a lot of other benefits. And that's why I brought up the book because yeah, Paul was saying that the the compounds in broccoli or vegetables, like they're only protecting you from the damage caused by vegetables themselves, making them a net neutral at best. But like we said, that's a bit of a reductive way to think about like hormesis and things that protect you from stressors.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes against systems thinking. Like if you understand systems thinking, you understand that complexity and the interconnection of various components is it kind of defines the system. And so there is a certain after a certain number of connections, like you get to a point where everything is just so much more related to everything else that it's unfathomable to be honest. I mean, you talk about melatonin or vitamin D3, these are, or even something like magnesium, it's responsible for like 3,000 different processes within the body. So again, just unfathomable complexity in my mind.
100%. Um, ChatGPT also said that um, so like UV signaling through POMC doesn't make UV carcinoprotective overall. They're saying that like you can get the benefits of POMC from like infrared light or visible light without the toxic effects of UVB.
So then why does the sun exist if it
Yeah,
includes UV invisible?
I think that's when you sort of like get into like because I'm a Christian, I believe in God. Like I don't believe that God would have created the sun if it were bad for us. But I think
100% agree. I like to take into account, like, for me, I think there's definitely, I think God exists. I think that evolutionary adaptation is a very real thing. I don't see them as contradictions. And from both angles, philosophically, like, it just does not make sense for us to demonize any light wavelength coming from the sun.
mm, yeah, and even without the religious argument, it's like we said, if the sun were causing skin cancer, like how are we still alive? Like that makes no sense.
Yeah. Too many
Um,
contradictions.
yeah, but okay, the next Steelman rebuttal is these like these hormetic benefits exist, but like you're like it's correct to say that small doses of UV might activate adaptive pathways, but it's still not worth the risk of the excessive activation that leads to mutations and carcinogenesis.
Well, excessive activation is a very nuanced discussion. I mean, if you get a sunburn that's really bad, then you've obviously gone over the threshold of what's safe, at least acutely. And so that the entire reason why I focus my work around circadian principles is to avoid that scenario in the first place, to not burn, to not get heat stroke. But even if you look at burns, I think that the literature does not show that burns cause skin cancer. I don't think there's been a single study actually that shows a causal link between burns and any form of cancer, especially skin cancers, because all of it's built on epidemiology. There's either an associational finding, observational finding. When a dermatologist says that if you get a sunburn at like 5 years old, you have a 400x increased risk of developing melanoma into your 40s, that's an association, that's not causal. And so, show me some evidence that's actually causal, and then I'll change my mind. But I don't think I did articles on sunburns. Sunburn is actually associated with in what was it? I forgot exactly what it was. I think it's a decreased risk of mortality, which is very interesting because according to centralized medicine, if you get sunburns over a lifetime, that should be associated with an increased risk of death, but it's showing the opposite. So I think there's a lot of very counterintuitive stuff available.
Yeah, the way I think about sunburns is that And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of it as like it's like your body's warning sign that you've had too much sunlight exposure. So like if you've got if you're covering yourself in sunscreen, you're not gonna get that warning signal, but you're still gonna get the UV light coming. Like, is that correct? Like it's the body's warning signal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in pre-modern times, sunburns were probably very rare and exceptional because the culture had mechanisms and they had this intuitive understanding, and they were in circadian alignment to the point where they wouldn't get a sunburn. So obviously they would build up more melanin. If they were at a higher latitude, I mean they're just not going to sunburn. And so, even even cultural practices that use different compounds that are natural in the environment to avoid sunburns as well in very high UV index environments. So I think it's an obvious sign that you've gone overboard in the same way that if you injure yourself by doing back squats, like that's an obvious sign you've neglected progressive overload or have bad form or got a shitty night of sleep or just didn't warm up properly. Like there are many different things that are responsible for that kind of outcome.
Right, yeah. And so if you are like wearing sunscreen and thinking that because you've got sunscreen on, you're going to be able to spend, say, like 6 hours in the sun, even though you've not actually prepared your body, like, would you say that them wearing sunscreen, like, would that sunscreen still, I guess, like, would that still extend the amount of time they're able to spend in the sun, or is it like, or like, is the skin cancer happening without them realizing?
It's very tricky to say. I think that the skin cancer and cancer in general, I mean, that's more of a chronic type of thing. So we can say that it is a contributing factor, but we can't say that it's, causal. I don't think, again, science shows that sunscreen causes any form of cancer as of yet. Maybe there's better science to be done. But I think one important point that I forgot to mention is that hormesis is dependent upon intentional exposure to a stressor and then the recovery phase. So with training, that's sleep. So,
Hmm.
training is not where you build muscle. Sleep is where you build muscle. And so it's very important to understand that you cannot break the two apart. You cannot divorce the two from one another, or else problems occur. And so, from my opinion, I think that if you get high UV index exposure and you really maximize that, it would not be in your best interest to make it very bright during the nighttime. You need that nighttime darkness because the skin repairs itself at night through darkness, through various mechanisms. And the circadian alignment is built upon that duality, proper duality of light and dark. So that's another important thing that I see. And I think that if you kind of neglect the nighttime darkness or you neglect the morning priming, you can create issues like hyperpigmentation or melasma or sunspots that, are sort of a manifestation of circadian alignment or circadian misalignment.
Mm. So you wouldn't say that like sunscreen causes skin cancer, but you also wouldn't say that it prevents skin cancer.
It certainly does not prevent skin cancer in my mind. I think there's actually research showing that there are meta-analyses that include quite a bit of studies that show that it's not protective of cancers at all. So why are you even doing it?
Yeah, because I think aren't there studies that show that like we use sunscreen more now, but we've got higher rates of skin cancer. Um, and then it's also like the fact that people get skin cancers on parts of the body that just aren't exposed to the sun at all, like the bottom of their foot, the back of their neck, like places that aren't exposed to the sun. So if it were the sun causing that, like that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, with melanoma specifically, I know that's a big contradiction. There are different types of melanoma that kind of behave differently, but I think that's one of the kind of final nails in the coffin. It's like how is this true if what you're saying with the standard philosophy, the ultimate truth involved here? And I think there's a lot more nuance to it. But again, like with science, you can prove anything any which way. So that's why I try to go back to the first principles, biological mechanisms, circadian biology, because it kind of takes the science out of it, and focuses more on mechanisms, which I think are largely neglected in the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, like it's not that sunscreen. Like sunscreen doesn't prevent skin cancer. It might prevent someone from getting a sunburn, but like we said, that's not really a benefit when you're suppressing that warning signal. Um, but yeah, just quickly, the last Steelman like rebuttal that ChatGPT said was that the the circadian signaling and the hormetic experience, it proves that the body can cope with UV, but not that UV is beneficial.
Well, doesn't that defeat the purpose of a hormetic adaptation? The point of hormesis is to create a stronger and healthier organism, not to just cope through it. Like the adaptations exist for a reason. I think that's to actually allow the organism to thrive in the environment, as opposed to any, discussion to the opposite. It just doesn't make
Mm.
sense.
Right, yeah. I think the reason, like, I think
Like
it
if
is,
you, sorry to interrupt, but if you
yeah,
train, if you back squat, eventually you get to like 250 pound back squat. Um, are your legs weaker because you've developed more muscle around your legs, or what? Like,
right,
no, they're
yeah,
obviously stronger, right? Because it's an adaptation that's necessary through hormesis.
exactly. And yeah, I think it is really important, well, for people like me to actually like try to understand the rebuttal that any of these dermatologists would have, but you would say that like it would never even get to this point, would it? Like where I'm having to debunk like ChatGPT's like steelman arguments because they wouldn't even think of them.
For the most part, I think that's true. Yeah, they wouldn't even think of like the key arguments because for you to kind of go against the key arguments that we're bringing up, I mean, you'd have to have a pretty good understanding of the circadian mechanisms involved. But again, these have a reductive myopic view. That's why they always say that sign of skin or DNA damage because that's all they've been taught. But they don't think about nucleotide excision repair, vitamin D3. They don't think about the system at large. And so they can't really comprehend the interconnections involved.
Right, yeah. So it's what P53 and what was it? Nucleotide in what was it?
Nucleotide excision repair is a DNA repair process that is fundamental that's also under circadian control. And so you'll find that a lot of these like NER, for example, is actually highest during midday, I believe, because obviously you get the most radiation, UV radiation from the sun at that time. This is also why we recommend that people get any radiological testing, like an X-ray, at that midday portion, and ideally sunbathe in the morning to prepare those anti-cancer defenses and really set circadian alignment into motion. It's some very interesting, related topics, but I think that obviously, during midday, you're going to have an upregulation of these anti-cancer defenses because they're designed to be exposed to this hormetic stressor that is UV.
Right, yeah. Like like we've been saying this whole time, it's the fact that yeah, like we're not saying that no amount of UV, we're not saying that like unlimited UV is safe. What we're saying is that each person's got like an individual threshold, but we can and should try to increase it through living in circadian alignment. Um, and if you're wearing sunscreen or sunglasses or looking at blue light at night or eating ultra processed foods or yeah, just spending your days indoors, you're not going to be getting that like adaptive response.
Yeah. And one last thing is I have a major problem with this myopic focus on UV exposure, the complete neglect of other things. I mean, if we're talking about skin cancer or cancer in general, or even skin health, like there are literally hundreds, like thousands of factors involved with that, whether it's sleep, light, the quality of your nutrition, mineral deficiencies, environmental pollutants and toxins. I mean, just imagine how long that list is. And yet we're only going to focus on UV that's been done in a very flawed study design and using associational findings and whatnot. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, it's just people just focus on like the sun and UV when it's like they just don't understand that we've got so many mechanisms um that our body designed to protect us from sun damage. Um, if we actually live in circadian alignment.
Exactly. That's the key. People are going to have to work to create circadian alignment, but once they're in it, I think that they notice a lot of beneficial effects.
Mm.
And I think that does place them in the best position to avoid chronic disease and just live a long and healthy life.
Right, yeah. So sort of as a last topic, um, you talked about how athletes would like you talked about how athletes would benefit from circadian alignment, and I think you said like the biggest contributing factor to like their injuries is a circadian mismatch. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think that's one reason why athletes get injured at a higher rate these days, considering the modern context and circadian disruption. But I think people kind of, run with that and they believe that it's the only reason that I'm explaining. It's Obviously, not the only reason. There's so many other reasons to it.
Right, like because I've been learning about like fascia and like the connective tissues that surround our muscles and bones and stuff. Would you say that's like sort of connected? Like, would you say fascia is sort of under circadian control, or is the research not there yet?
I think you can say that fascia is under circadian control. There's some interesting research pointing to kind of that conclusion. Fascia is, I think you can kind of classify fascia as like this, body-wide communication network where maybe there's a transfer of free electrons. I mean, we know that there's something called the living matrix, which is made of collagen and ground substance in the body that is actually designed to transfer free electrons from one place to, any area that has chronic inflammation or damage that needs it. That gets into grounding, biological semiconduction, but I think it's a very deep rabbit hole. But fascia is very interesting. I mean, I'd have to educate myself a lot more. I did write an article on fascia, and I think that there's some photoconduction properties to it, the ability of light to have an influence on it in a major way. And of course, the movement, the hydration, the grounding, the redox state, all of that's going to play a fundamental role in the quality of fascia.
Yeah, 100%. I'm having someone else on to talk about fascia. That'll be really good in the future. But one last question is how do you encourage people to go about like having these discussions with people who just can't see the bigger picture, but whether it's they've just been indoctrinated into believing like the sun causes skin cancer and sunscreen prevents skin cancer because like I've said, like I always tell people that like for me, I'd say the thing I try to emphasize the most is that we have the ability to increase our tolerance to sun exposure, and we should. Um, and the whole narrative that like the sun causes skin cancer and we should wear sunscreen and sunglasses, that's built off of the assumption that it's impossible to increase your body's tolerance to it. And like it just always comes back to, oh, well, like I don't know the science, but I think these dermatologists know it better than you do. But then like we've just done, we've gone through all of their rebuttals that like in the chance that they actually think of them, like we are able to rebut what they're saying. So how would you like what would you say is the best and most effective way to spread the message?
Most effective, I think, is just kind of being very consistent with the education. I think that's key because it's very easy to get into arguments about this stuff. And eventually that will lead to like a never-ending rabbit hole that achieves nothing but spreading hate and whatnot. So I think that it depends on the person that you're talking to. Some people are very scientifically minded, and you can sway them in like 5 minutes by pointing out things like POMC or melanin and all of its various functions. But other people, I think some people won't be saved. Some people will always believe in that authority bias. I think even pointing out things like authority bias is a very important thing. Talking about Flexner Report, how mainstream medicine came to be, is also important from a historical perspective. Um, there's it's difficult. It's really difficult to try to get these narratives across, but I think my role in it is just to spread the education and kind of have like a fascinating lens to it. So people can come in if they want to, but I think I'm more focused on arguing with mainstream practitioners as opposed to just everyday people who believe in what they say. Because if I can show you that this dermatologist is stupid and myopic in their understanding of this subject, then that opens a whole new world for you. Because then it goes against the idea that mainstream medicine is infallible. There are things like iatrogenesis, harm caused by the recommendation of medical professionals or surgeries that are not needed. That is a huge problem these days. And either way, I just think there's a huge process of enlightenment, and it's a very arduous process, to say the least.
Yeah. Because obviously when you're talking to everyday people, you're never going to be able to convince them using like by saying like, oh well, POMC makes alpha MSH, which makes melanin, which protects like or P53. Like you're never going to be able to use that type of nomenclature, and it always just comes back to like, well, I might not know the science, but these dermatologists do, and it's like I just think it's so frustrating. I think credentialism is like pun intended, but like cancer. It is a cancer. It really
The
is.
most pervasive chronic disease out there, for sure.
Yeah, it's like this whole obsession of like if they've studied it, if they're in the system, um, then they're automatically right. And I've tried to tell people about like the history of whether it's like Ansel Keys and cholesterol, or it's like I think Robert O'Becker, right? Or was it Thomas O'Becker?
Robert.
Robert O'Becker, the EMF, and how like that was suppressed. Like they might listen to it, but then they might also go, oh well, you can't just use corruption as an excuse to like completely dismiss what all of these dermatologists have been saying. And it's like, yeah, I'm not using it. I'm just explaining that just because they've got their credentials doesn't mean that what they're saying is automatically correct, and nobody else has a rebuttal.
Yeah, I mean, to put it into perspective, 2016 was when Harvard did a very like large assessment over what's called iatrogenesis, which just means harm that is directly or indirectly caused by the recommendations of a medical professional. I mean, again, think of like a pharmaceutical drug that creates side effects or surgery not needed or something of that nature. And they showed that they calculated this and they showed that iatrogenesis was basically the third leading cause of death in the United States when they took everything into account. And that was pre-pandemic. So if you consider post-pandemic, I would argue it's probably second, maybe even number one. So the very people who are, the most credentialed, who are sitting at the highest point of the ivory tower, those are the very people who are creating the conditions for iatrogenesis to take hold of this country. So, keep that word in mind. Iatrogenic harm, iatrogenesis, that's a big point that I always try to tell people because, the credentialism thing and the authority bias is a huge problem these days.
Yeah. I what was it? Iatrogenesis.
Yeah,
So that's like medical negligence,
basically. And
right?
that's something that it's something that practitioners don't want to talk about. I would argue that a lot of doctors don't even know what the word means, which just goes to the point of like, okay, this system is inherently maybe corrupt, but also just it's incomplete and it's creating problems as a result of that incompleteness.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I don't think these dermatologists have like malicious intent. I think they've just been indoctrinated, and obviously it's easy for like someone who's never been part of the system to say that, but like if you're part of the system, you're not gonna want you're not gonna want to see the other side. Like even if like you're gonna suppress anyone telling you that like you might be indoctrinated, you're not gonna want to see the bigger picture.
True. You're going to preserve identity, and I think that takes hold for most people.
Yeah, I always see comments on your posts that are like, "What are your credentials? What are your credentials?" And it's like, why does that matter unless you can actually like use your credentials to debunk what they're saying? Um, like I'll have comments that say stuff like, "This is wrong. I know a dermatologist. This is wrong. My friend's got a dermatology degree," and it's like, unless you can actually use that degree to tell me why I'm wrong, why does
Yeah,
that like, if anything, it's embarrassing if you can't.
exactly. Because then it tells me that your degree does not include circadian mechanisms, which, circadian biology is the foundation of human health. So how taught that? And why is the system not teaching you that? I think those are some very interesting questions that lead to some enlightening answers, to say the least.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, this was such a great episode. I think we really went in depth beyond like we actually really like spoke deeply about the topic. So I think it's great for people to listen, whether they're new to the topic or they're trying to learn how to explain it to their friends. I think this was a great podcast. So yeah, where can people find you?
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I think that they can find me at Zaid K Dahhaj, ZaidKDahhaj on most platforms, X, Instagram, Substack. The Circadian Classroom publication on Substack is great. It's more of a deep dive on various subjects. And then the 2 a.m. podcast is more so a eclectic, fun deep dive with various guests and my co-hosts. But for the most part, that's where they can find me.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Zaid. This was such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. It was a fun time.
If you enjoyed that episode of the Ancestral Cure podcast, please give it a like, give it a comment, and share it to your friends. Your support means so much to me here, and thank you all for listening.